Hi, everybody. My name is Logan, and welcome to session 3 of a 12-part series that we have going here for Manhattan Prep, partnering with GRE Club. This is a series that's going to be happening every Thursday at the same time, and it's going to be going for 9 more weeks after this one, covering everything that you need to know for the GRE. Our first 2 sessions, we had one session covering a general recommendation set of how to study for the exam. Last week we had our first math session, and this week we have our first verbal focused session, and we're going to be talking about reading comprehension. So I've been teaching the GRE for about 8 years. Reading comprehension, I think, is one of the most fascinating parts of the test, because unlike math, where there's a lot of stuff to learn and you can practice your math, you can learn all the new skills and improve by learning formulas and things like that. Unlike vocab questions, where you can learn vocab to sort of have more facts at your disposal when you are answering vocab questions, there is not as clear of a path in reading comprehension. And it's hard to get better at reading. There's not more facts to learn about reading to help you with this part of the exam. So it's really about calibrating your approach to how the exam wants you to read, because every single passage you're going to see is going to be on a different subject that you've never seen before. No amount of learning new facts will necessarily get you more ready for that. What we're going to focus on in this presentation is how and why reading for the GRE is different than reading in real life. If you walked in and took the GRE tomorrow and you hadn't studied at all, you hadn't reviewed any GRE verbal content, you might get a certain score that reflects, your reading level, or you might actually get a score that is lower than you're capable of because you're reading in a way that's too similar to how you read out in the real world. What we'll talk about today is how to calibrate your reading to how the test wants you to read, and how to know what to expect in the questions and in the answer choices that you have available to you. We'll be talking about the passages that you'll read, the questions that you'll see, and the types of answer choices that you have to choose from, and how can you be ready for the different things that they're going to throw at you. Thanks for being here for the session. I can see the chats that you all are sending, so if you have any comments or questions as we're going through, send them my way, and I will do my best to answer them as we are live here. First, I am going to show you just what the GRE verbal reading comprehension questions look like, how many of them, the basics like that. So this is what most of them look like: a passage, a question, and 5 answer choices. That's going to be the 3 parts of our presentation today, learning what to expect with the passage, the question, and the answer choices. Most of the time, this is what you see: 5 multiple choice answers. For each passage, 1, 2, or 3 questions. 2 is probably the most common. These are 2 variations that you'll see every once in a while. One is select all that apply. So we won't be doing any of either of these today, but if you see any select all questions on the exam, there'll be 3 options, and just know that it could be all of them. It cannot be none of them. There will always be at least 1 correct answer in select all that apply. So pick 1, 2, or 3 out of the 3. Then even more rarely, you have a select the sentence passage or question, that is, where they ask you to click on a certain question or click on a certain sentence that means a certain thing. And those look like this, where you're literally clicking around in the passage. There is also a whole separate type of passage that you might see, that you will see a few times, and these are argument-based passages. These are going to be the subject of another lesson in a few weeks that I'm going to be teaching as well. Argument structure passages have a pretty different approach that you need to take, so we're going to categorize them out differently. You know it's one of these argument passages when instead of asking about what the author meant by something or what could you prove from the passage, they're asking about an argument that was in the passage. Here the question is, which of the following, if true, most seriously undermines the argument? Usually the argument passages are going to be asking, what would improve this argument? What would undermine this argument, like this one says? What assumptions is this argument based on?
And these are a little bit more based on logic and less based on a close reading of the passage itself. So we're going to cover these separately in a couple weeks. Another big thing to know about reading comprehension is where is it going to show up on the exam? And the exam comes in certain patterns of the question formats. So this is the first verbal section. Anytime you take the test, the first verbal section will look something like this. The first three will be text completion. This is one of our vocab types. Then you'll have a couple of reading comprehension from probably just one passage. Then you'll have a set of 4 sentence equivalences. This is another vocab type that will be covered in a different session. And then at the end of the section, you have another set of reading comprehension. It's really helpful for both quant and verbal to know this rhythm of what question types, what formats you're going to see, because it helps you break down the section into even shorter sort of sprints where you are aware of what they're about to do, what they are about to be asking you. Reading comprehension comes in 2 chunks, one around the middle of the verbal section and one towards the end. And in the second section, the longer one, it's a similar pattern. Text completion, then a little bit of reading comprehension, then sentence equivalence, then a longer chunk of reading comprehension. It's the same pattern, just longer sections of questions in this second verbal section. So some people in the verbal part of the exam like to do it out of order. They like to do all the reading comprehension first or all the vocab first. Remember, you can do that. You can always click next and previous and kind of navigate around to whatever question you want to go to. A lot of people ask, do I recommend that or do I not recommend that? I would say that depends on the person. And if you want to take the section out of order, I would practice it on your practice exams and to figure out from that what your own personal approach might be. I did see one comment in the chat that says you've seen a sentence equivalence, I think it is, in question 11. So this can vary. It may not always be exactly these amounts, but one thing I can tell you is that it should always be exactly these orders: text completion, reading comprehension, sentence equivalence, and then reading again. And typically the longest chunk of reading comprehension is going to be towards the end. And generally what we found recently is on the official exams, it does follow most of the time this particular pattern. But if it varies on one exam that you see, don't be too shocked. Okay, let's talk about the actual passages. Remember that the passages are just one part. Sometimes people over-focus on the passages and they are too obsessed with reading over and over what the passage says, and they're not actually paying enough attention to the questions themselves. That said, it's still very important to read and understand the passage first. What I'm going to just cover here is what should you be doing as you read the passage, and how can you maybe work to better expect what the passages are going to try to do. Read this top paragraph here. I want you to imagine that this was the start of a passage that you're going to read all of. I just want you to read this first section for a moment. By the time you get about this far into a passage, so about one sentence, this is kind of a run-on sentence, but that's not uncommon for the GRE passages. They're not always the most readable, the most reader-friendly passages, I would say. Sometimes there's long run-on sentences and things. As you get a little bit into the passage, you should already be thinking, what is this going to be about? And not just the topic, but what is the story going to be about? It's very rare that a GRE passage is just going to be a list of facts. Most of the time, there's going to be a narrative. There is going to be some sort of conflict, some sort of start and finish, or some sort of relationship that is being explored. So if your summary this far in was something like, it's about Zorch mining, which, by the way, I don't believe is a real thing. Sometimes on the GRE, you'll be asked about passages where you have no idea what they're talking about. So some of our made up passages include literally made up things to make sure that you don't know what they're talking about. If you are just saying it's about Zorch mining, that's a good start, but we need to know more as we're reading the passages. I can tell already by reading this intro that it's going to be about how this type of mining is causing damage. They're talking about the damage that is happening, and clearly they're going to go on and say more about it. Maybe they're going to be talking about how we can mediate the damage so that it's not so bad. Maybe they're going to be talking about protests that are happening against this damage. Maybe they're going to be talking about a new discovery of why these damages are happening, etc. But it's definitely going to be about how Zorch mining is causing environmental damage. This is a better summary because it starts with a subject and it has a story or an action that is happening. When you are reading a passage, always try to keep both of these things in mind, not just the subject, but also what is happening, the story. One of the big ways to do that is by taking notes. So this is a common question, is how much should I be taking notes? This is another thing that I think varies from student to student, but generally I would say taking notes is a good thing, and the way to do it is to make what we often call like a headline list. These are taking the big points and jotting them down as maybe bullet points on your paper while you are taking the exam. The longer the passage, the more important it is to take notes. So if you have a short passage that is pretty easy for you to read, you may not need to take as many notes for that one. If you have a long one or one that you're having trouble following, taking notes, I think, becomes really very helpful. And I would start doing this in your practice sessions as well, in your practice exams. It's not just about on the test day you start taking notes. You can practice your note taking so that you can, number one, be in the habit, and number two, kind of develop your own shorthand of knowing what your notes mean. A couple questions in the chat that I think are really good ones to talk about. Thanks, Akshay, for asking those. Won't this reduce your speed? It might, and that is why I would say there is a place where some people end up taking too many notes. But I would also say if you reduce your speed a bit in reading the passage to take notes, it still might help you increase your speed or at least answer more accurately while you are answering the questions. When you are doing the reading part of verbal, I would say about a minute per passage to read on average. Some of them will be shorter, some longer, but about a minute per passage and then a minute per question, maybe a minute to a minute and a half. And if you are extending your reading time by a few seconds, but you are increasing your accuracy of understanding the passage, that's still going to pay off because you'll be able to get more points if you get the questions right that you wouldn't have before. Nothing will tank your reading score quickly or more quickly than if you have a passage that you completely flub. If you have a 2 or 3 question passage and you miss them all because you didn't really understand the passage well enough, that's a big chunk taken out of your verbal score. So that's why even if it does take a little more time, I think taking notes to make sure that you understand, who are the main characters in the story and what's going on, what's the conflict, what's the story, it definitely does pay off. And your other question actually was, would you recommend reading the question before reading the passage? Yeah, this was something I was going to cover when we got to the questions themselves. I do think reading the questions first is usually a good move because it tells you what to read for. I've met some students who don't like to do that because then they feel like it's distracting while they're reading the passage to be thinking about the questions. If that's you, it's okay. Find what works for you. But I definitely recommend at least trying an approach where you look at the questions first, and that'll show you what details you might need to focus on most in the passage, and it will help you better identify if there's any sections of the passage that don't really matter. Because sometimes that does happen. Sometimes there's a story taking place in the article that parts of it show up in the questions, parts of it don't. If you take a look at the questions first, you can know if there's parts that are a little bit more extraneous. One of the other questions I see in the chat, thanks for this one, is I'm not a great reader about detailed reading. How do I develop that focus? That is a really good question and a really hard one to answer. And it's one of the reasons why I actually think focusing on answer choice analysis is the first place where I start when I'm working with students on reading comprehension. Improving your reading ability, it will happen. It will happen through practice, but it's a little bit, it's more personalized in terms of what I would recommend to do. I would have to see how you are reading. I would have to, you would have to, try out different techniques of reading to see what works best for you. In terms of learning what types of answer choices to watch out for, I think that is something that I can recommend much more across the board, and that is actionable for any student. And so a lot of the rest of the presentation is going to focus on that. And as for how to, what things I would recommend on the surface to improve reading focus, one of them is you can go out and read similar content to what is on the exam. The GRE's passages, usually they're not written from scratch. Usually they are adapted from sources that publish sort of academic writing in English about topics like politics, history, science, etc. So places like the New Yorker magazine or Science magazine, or newspapers like prominent English language newspapers. These are places that the GRE takes their passages from almost word for word sometimes. If you go out and read these types of sources, you will be kind of acclimating yourself, getting used to reading the type of content that you're going to see on the exam. And another way to, I think, improve your detail-focused reading is by taking notes. That's one reason why I kept this slide in here for this presentation. If you're struggling with understanding what the passages mean, I think building a real habit of every time you read, take a few notes. Make sure your notes focus on the headlines of the most important things of the passage, which include, the subject and the story. I think over time you'll see some improvement on how you're able to interpret the passages. One of the questions I also see there, I see a couple more and then I'm going to move on into a few more slides, is about the logic-based reading comprehension. That's going to be the focus of another lesson in a couple of weeks. And so we're not going to focus on that as much. Here's another tip that I think can help you get used to reading the GRE passages and absorbing as much of them as you can, which is there are certain archetypes, there are certain patterns in the passages that you can pick up on and make them a little bit more simple to hold on to what they are saying. Many sort of TVs or movie genres or book genres, there are very strong patterns. If you watch a family sitcom or a Western movie, you can sort of predict some of the plot points because if you've seen one before, it's going to hit some of the same points. The same thing happens on the GRE. There are very common patterns in what the types of structures and conflicts are in the GRE passages. I don't have a super formal list. The GRE doesn't say, hey, we publish these 8 types of passage archetypes. But I just want to show you a few that I've noticed are really common. And whenever I'm reading, like taking a real GRE, for example, I try to identify as quick as I can, what's the structure of this passage and how is it similar to other passages I've seen before? Because that helps me worry a little bit less about the, about the overall structure and focus more easily on the specific content details of this passage. So here's a few of those common structures that I see over and over. One of them is competing theories on a subject. So that Zollrich mining passage, it might have become One group thinks Zollrich mining can be made more sustainable, but another group thinks Zollrich mining is going to stay very damaging for the environment no matter what we do. And the passage would be about comparing those theories about what Zollrich mining might become. A critic's opinion about a work. So this is more often in the sort of literature or culture type of passages. It might be someone thinks that this symphony that Mozart made was his worst one yet, and here's why they didn't like it. These are incredibly common, and I think that these are common because the GRE wants to see if you can separate the author's opinion from the critic's opinion. The author might think X, the critic might think Y, and then the third part, Z, might be understanding the original subject that the critic was commenting on, and now the author is commenting on that critic. A lot of passages are about a question that is up for. So back to the Zollrich mining example, it might be people are wondering about why Zollrich mining is causing these negative effects. The answer might be because of such and such chemical that is leaking into the ground when they are doing Zollrich mining and causing something to happen. This is a very common one as well. And the last one that I have here, there are other common patterns, but here's just another one to watch out for, is a cause and effect. This is very common in the scientific ones. The Zollrich mining passage also could have been this, saying, hey, here's the damages and here's the process why that is happening. If you get used to these and some of the other common archetypes, you'll just pick up on them easily and say, oh, here's another passage where it's competing theories on a subject. This time the subject is why did such and such political movement happen in the 19th century? Oh, this time it's another competing theories on a subject, but this time it's competing theories on how old are these ruins in South America. You can see how understanding the repeated format can help you basically adapt to the new content a little more easily. Okay, now we're getting into what I think is the good stuff, though. I think that most students improve the most, not by getting better at reading the passages, but by getting better at reading the questions and understanding the questions and the answer choices. So let's talk about the types of questions and answer choices that you're going to see, and we will practice a couple of questions before the end of the session. There are three main question types, although these two are quite similar. The first one is a main idea question. So, So questions about what is the whole point of this passage? And a lot of times they look like this. The author is primarily concerned with which of these best describes the main idea of the passage, similar things to that. Then we've got detail questions and inference questions. Detail questions are just asking you, what did the passage say? According to the passage, what happened? Inference questions are similar, but they are a little bit less literal, where it's asking you to read between the lines a little bit. The passage implies, or the author suggests, these are things that weren't literally stated in the passage, but we're still supposed to be able to prove them based on the passage. So what do we do about each of these three types? Well, in that first type, the main idea, it's really about matching that summary that you came up with, finding a one-sentence summary of the passage, and you should be able to answer most main idea questions without really looking back at the passage, just from understanding the purpose of the passage. Detail and inference questions, it's all about finding the evidence. And this gets us into the most important thing that I meant at the beginning when I said reading on the GRE is a little bit different than reading in real life. Reading on the GRE is incredibly focused on this skill, finding the evidence. In Real world reading, when you're reading an email at work, if you're reading a news article about something happening in your city, if you're reading a book about something, or like a narrative book with a story, it's usually a good thing to try to connect what you're reading to other ideas. Connect that email that you're reading to the rest of what you know about the project you're working on. Connect that news story to the rest of what you know in your life of what's going on in your town. Connect this one part of the story to another part that you read before to try to predict what's going to happen next, or to understand a certain character storyline. On the GRE, these connecting of what you see to what else you know is usually going to lead you into a trap. You have to focus on finding the evidence and making sure that what you are choosing was proven by what the passage said. Like I mentioned a moment ago, in inferences, the evidence may not be quite as clearly stated, but it should still be proven in the passage. If you bring in assumptions, if you bring in what you know about the subject from the real world, if you bring in what you think would kind of make sense based on what the passage said, you're going to be leading yourself into a risky situation. And whenever I'm on a detailed question, or whenever I'm teaching a student on a detailed question, I try to point at literally on the screen, here is where the evidence is for my answer. It gets tough sometimes. There can be a fine line between what is proven and what is not. But if you focus on making sure your answer is in the passage, you'll be in a good, healthy spot. Let's get into those answers now. And for most of the rest of the session, we're going to be looking at just a couple of questions, but really diving into what are these answer choices doing. So I'm going to pop up a question here, or excuse me, a passage and two questions. I'm going to give a couple of minutes for you all to read this passage. And if you like, you can even jot down a couple of notes. Like I said, jot down the main idea, one sentence summary. And in a couple of minutes, we'll dive into these questions and look at the answer choices. Earlier, someone asked, should we look at the questions first? This one is a good example of why that can sometimes help. If you looked at the two questions on the exam, you would know that, as usual, you're going to have to understand the primary purpose. Most of the time, there is at least one main idea-related question. And you will know that the other part to pay most attention to is whenever they mention Darwin and Fabre. So sometimes it helps you sort of put a spotlight on that important focus topic. Let's look at this primary purpose question first. Here's the actual answer choices. Take a minute to read these. Try to think about not only what answer you think is right, but what's wrong with some of the wrong answers. If you think you know the right answer, you can put it in the chat. Okay, we have votes so far for A and for E. If you are working on improving reading comprehension, one of the biggest things that I would recommend to do is when you're practicing, don't just pick what answer you think is right and move on. Pick what answer you think is right and try to articulate to yourself, why is this one correct? Why is this one proven from the passage? And then go through all of the ones that you're not choosing and say, why is this one wrong? Why is this one straying from what the passage had? There's always going to be a reason why each wrong answer is wrong. So what we're about to do is like an answer choice analysis, going just in order, A, B, C, D, E, talking about why is it wrong, why is it right. Even if you think the correct one is A, go all the way to E, because the A could be like an almost correct trap answer, and E could be something that's even better. In this one, A and E are the two that you all have voted for, and I will say it is one of them. So let's look through B, C, and D first to talk about why they are not quite right. B argues that insects are unique in their dependence on rigid outcomes. And I would say that is the issue here. We are talking about insect behavior. We are talking about rigid outcomes. And we are saying that insects have sort of rigid behavior, but this word unique is not mentioned. They don't say ever that insects are the only types of creatures who do this. So actually, you called it out of scope. I think that's a decent way to describe it. But I would go even a little further and say that this is a very common trap of sort of a false comparison. Or maybe a better phrasing would have been just like an unmentioned comparison. Calling them unique is saying that, okay, insects are like this and everyone else is not like this. We never made that comparison to other types of creatures in quite this strong of a way. So B is wrong. C, also wrong. You all were right to avoid that one. We are talking about mothers here. We are talking about the behavior of wasps while they are burrowing, but there's more here. And so this is a type of wrong answer for main purpose questions in general, where it's actually a little bit too general. The author had a more specific goal in mind when writing this passage. D is the exact opposite. This is too specific to be the main point. We were not that focused on comparing and contrasting these two researchers. Even though their names came up, we were talking more importantly about what both A and E mention, which is how these insects are behaving in a rigid manner. We weren't really focused on these two individuals. So this dichotomy here is common in main idea questions. It's very common that there will be at least one answer that is too general. It's actually like not quite getting at the purpose. And it's very common there will be at least one answer that's too specific. It's talking about something that is smaller, more specific to one particular detail than what the passage was really saying. A and E were both ones that you all considered, and the real right answer is E, not A. The difference between E and A is one of the biggest tips that I have for you. A is a little too strong. And this is one of the most common types of wrong answers. If we look back at the passage, let's look at the phrases that they use. Insect behavior generally appears to be explicable in terms of unconscious, inflexible stimulus response mechanisms. They don't quite get to proving anything. They are arguing, but they are not proving. Proving means beyond a shadow of a doubt, you have been able to show that this is the reality. And they're not quite arguing that they totally lack consciousness. They are saying that they appear to behave in a automatic way of sorts, where the responses never change to certain stimulus. But they don't get into the idea of consciousness to say insects have no consciousness, period. Proving that they lack consciousness is just a stronger version of the real reality, which was that they were arguing that they appear to be unconscious. See how A is just an overly strong version of the same idea that is expressed in E, the correct one. This premise shows up over and over again on reading comprehension passages and questions, where some wrong answers are just overly strong versions of the correct answer. So for that reason, I want you to think about red and green flag words in the answer choices. So the slide doesn't exactly say it, so I'll write it out here. What we're talking about here, words in the answer choices. These words that you see on screen right now are words to have a red flag around. And that doesn't mean that you'll never ever choose an answer choice that has these words, but I want you to be suspicious. Be careful with answers that include these words. If we're trying to prove something, if we're saying something always happens, if we're saying that we confirmed something or that something never happens, words like this are very extreme. They have strong opinions. And they are most importantly hard to prove. When your answer choice is hard to prove, you better make sure that the evidence in the passage proved it. The flip side is that if you see nice, neutral words, that these are going to be easy to prove. And I am definitely not saying that you should automatically choose any answer choice you see that has these words. But I am saying that when you see words like suggests or appears to or could, these words are easy to prove, which means it's more likely that the passage proved them. So be interested in answer choices that have these words and be a little bit suspicious of answer choices that have these words. Yeah, actually, a great question. You said, can you explain why argue as well as a red flag? This is a perfect example of how it is sort of contextual, because I think the answer choice we just said was correct, included the word argue. Well, in that case, the passage was arguing things. It was saying, it seems like these insects are behaving in a sort of automatic way. Argue, I would say, if we compare it to some of the words in this next slide, like illustrate or examine, it's a lower bar to be illustrating or examining something than it is to be arguing something. Arguing means that the author has a certain perspective. Sometimes they may not be advocating for any certain perspective. It did just so happen that in the one that we just did, the author did have a certain perspective that they were sort of explaining. So argue was okay. That's why I would say it's more about being careful than avoiding them outright. I'll pause here to answer a couple of other questions before we go to the next overall problem that we're going to do. Pratham, you had asked, long passages can have up to 4 questions. Is that right? Or can there be more number of questions associated to a long passage as well? So the very long passages that the GRE used to have, and that some publicly available GRE resources still have, they are not really on the exam anymore. Since they shortened the exam a few years ago to be about an hour less than it used to be, to have the questions or the sections be 12 and 15 questions instead of it used to be 20. The very long passages you used to see with 4+ questions, we have not seen them since then. So I would say you don't need to worry about preparing for long passages that have 4 questions or more. The maximum number of questions per passage that we've been seeing in recent years is about 3. And if we go back to the passage that we are doing, this length is pretty much the typical length that you're going to see of 1 long paragraph, sometimes 2 long paragraphs, but you used to see ones that were more like 3 to 4 paragraphs, and now I would say do not expect to see any that are so long as that. And then actually you have another great question of how to avoid zoning out while reading really boring and long passages. Well, going back to the idea of taking notes, I think that is another reason to take notes is it helps prevent you from zoning out while you are reading a passage. It makes it more of an active activity. And it forces your brain to be checking in, making sure you understand at various instances. Another tip that I would say is to, if you do zone out for a moment while you are reading a passage, don't get too discouraged. This is okay. You can take a deep breath. You can go back and start the passage again, and maybe take notes that time. If not taking notes, I would say you could even like put your finger on the screen and use it to follow along with where you are reading. You can, use your body in either by writing or by putting your finger on the screen to basically keep yourself engaged. And whether you're at the test center or taking the exam at home, I've never had anyone have an issue with sort of pointing at the screen. It might feel a little silly, but I do think that it's something that can work to make sure you're remembering like where you are in the passage as you read. Definitely at some point you might zone out while reading a passage. I would say when that moment happens, that feel that necessarily it is slipping away. That is why the reading passages and questions take a little bit longer. Even though they're about half the questions, I would say about 2/3 of your time on the verbal section is probably going to be spent on reading comprehension. And it's totally normal for some of that time to be going, oh, I just spaced out for a second. Let me go back and read that bit again. Let's do the second question. So this is the more detail-oriented question. When you see something about like, why does the author mention, this is asking you to look specifically at the passage and try to point at, and again, you can literally point with your finger if you want, at the screen and try to find where is the evidence. So take a moment, try to answer this question, and try to find the evidence for your answer. I've got a couple votes in the chat. They are both correct for answer choice C. Again, even if you get one right, I think that it will build up your skills and confidence on reading comprehension if you go through A through E and try to label why each one was wrong and why the one you chose was right. So let's do that. And then we'll look at why C was correct. So A, contradict the conventional wisdom. That is an issue here because this passage isn't really talking about conventional wisdom and how Darwin and Fabre changed that. So this is a common type of basically not mentioned answer. A lot of wrong answers, to be honest. There's just things that weren't even mentioned in that it's talking about what other people might have thought. Well, the passage didn't tell us what other people might have thought. B, yeah, you said it actually. It's the maternal affection. This was not really an issue that was discussed. Yes, we are talking about a female Sphex wasp who has an egg. So this is a wasp mother, but we're not talking about affection. And I would say specifically this is something they do often, which is bring in a word that is maybe a little bit too much of an emotional tone. This is just describing the facts of how the insects behave. It's not describing really what the insects might be feeling, what emotions they might be feeling. So talking about affection is too off topic. C, provide experimental evidence of the inflexibility. Yes, we know that we are exploring the idea of inflexibility. And if we look at where Darwin and Fabre were mentioned, we see the fact that what Darwin discovered is that even though the behavior appears thoughtful, in the case of these grasshoppers, it actually had a mechanistic character. So this is what I mean when I say you want to often like point and find the literal evidence. Darwin's evidence is exploring the mechanistic character of this behavior, and that relates to the inflexibility that we're looking for. Same thing with what Fabre looked into, which is that doing a lot of different trials, 40 trials of a certain experiment, the wasp's response never changed. Again, exploring this idea of a repeated and inflexible response. Inflexible response. And importantly, experiments are mentioned for both of these scientists that they did. D, actually, you said in the chat that there's an issue of exploring. I think the word explore is maybe okay here. Explore is one of these friendly words where talking about anything could sometimes be like exploring the idea that you are talking about. I would say the issue is kind of the logical implications. I don't think what we're finding here is logical implications. That would be saying what's going to happen next because of this mechanistic behavior. What does it mean about insects if they're behaving this way? And we're not really going that far. We're literally just trying to prove that their behavior is inflexible, as answer choice C says. And then E, yep, you said it in the chat, historical changes. Just like conventional wisdom, these are just not mentioned. So it's so common that they put in things like A and like E, where they're just pointing out, or they just add extra details in the answer choice that weren't even mentioned. And if you're being sharp and looking for the passage and making sure you can identify the evidence of what you're choosing, you're going to avoid falling in those traps because you're going to find the place that did prove what you're picking. So this is a pretty classic example of a detailed question to go along with the pretty classic example of the big picture question that we looked at before. Let me pop up those three question types again and just say a few quick things before we wrap up. Okay. To reiterate some main points. Be ready for one main idea question per passage. It's very, very common that there is one main idea question for each passage. And use your summary. Use your summary. Your one sentence simple story that you maybe thought of while reading to answer the main idea questions. For detail and inference questions, like we just saw, make sure that you find the evidence. For both of them, follow the advice that I had about avoiding answer choices for the most part that have very, very strong evidence, or sorry, that have very, very strong words in the answer choices because they're harder to prove. Lean towards the answer choices that have milder ideas in the answers because those are easier to prove. Be careful about answer choices that are bringing in things that sound kind of logical, but they just weren't in there. So many times when I work with students on reading comprehension, the most common thing they're doing is they're picking answers that sound like they make sense. They sound good, but there's just not quite enough evidence in the passage to explain them. I see your question actually about what if you're unable to understand the rich vocab words. So that's a really good question, and I think that is a part of the challenge of reading comprehension is that sometimes there are advanced vocab words in the passages themselves. So first off, that's another good reason to study vocab. I do think learning more words helps pretty much everyone on the GRE because it just means there's less mystery as you're reading and solving each question. If you learn 100 words over your studying, some of them are going to show up and they're going to help you more intuitively understand not just understanding the answer choice in vocab, but understand what the passages are saying while you read them for the first time as well. And if you are struggling to understand a word that is in a passage, I would try to figure out, is this word essential to understand, or is this word kind of jargon? The passages do sometimes include jargon type words, by which I mean knowing the exact definition maybe isn't the most important part. For example, if I were to go back to our passage here about Zollrich mining, it's probably not important for you to understand exactly what is Zollrich mining and how is it different from coal mining. But it is going to be important for you to understand the damages that it's causing. So sometimes you can read around, we call it, read around these sort of jargon words. Actually, I see your comment about discussing like romantics and that in India you haven't learned about necessarily some of those historical figures in your history. And it is true that if you know about the subject, if you've learned about the subject previously, it doesn't hurt when you're reading the passage. But what I would say is that there's really no way to sort of learn everything from every passage that you might see. What it's really about is getting used to reading and staying focused while you are reading these difficult passages, boring passages that you may not be interested in. Something that you might think about while you're reading to wrap up is, imagine that you had to text your friend and explain what the passage was about. What would you say? What is the simplest, most exciting sounding version that you could say to someone about what is happening? If you try, you might even be able to come up with what you would tell someone about Zollrich mining. That's a big scandal to make them feel somewhat interested in the story. Again, we're starting from pretty boring starting points sometimes, so it's not always going to be the easiest to do that. But if you're looking for like a frame of mind of how to get invested in these stories, of how to stay focused, and how to sort of condense them into something that is clear enough and concise enough to answer a main idea question, that's one frame of mind you might use as well. Is what would I text my friend about this passage? Say, hey, I just read a passage about, what would you say? It's about time to wrap up. So to reiterate one of the main points I made earlier, reading on the GRE is different than reading in real life, and there's a few ways that it is that we covered today. One of them is that it's going to be very consistent patterns in what you read. As you keep going in your GRE studying, you are going to notice that sometimes you are seeing similar patterns emerge in these passages like we discussed. Number two, you are going to stay very focused on what the passage said. You're not going to bring in outside information of what would kind of make sense. You're going to make sure that you can point at and prove every answer choice that you are choosing. There is more depth in reading comprehension, especially with the logic-based side, which I'm going to be covering with you all in a couple of weeks. Of course, that there is another half of the verbal section, which is the vocab-based questions that are going to be covered in another session coming up as well. So hopefully there were some helpful tips in this session for you all. A couple notes before I wrap up. Manhattan Prep, we do have free session ones of our online GRE classes. So if you go to our website, the GRE section, you'll be able to find a place to sign up for a free first session. And we also have a what's called a free starter kit for the GMAT, GRE, and executive assessment. So these are resources that will kind of guide you through some of the resources that we do have available for free to sort of give yourself a start in your studies. For the GRE specifically, one thing I can also recommend on YouTube is our free prep hour series, somewhat similar to these. If you go to our Manhattan Prep GRE YouTube channel, you'll find a ton of hour-long webinars or lessons on literally every topic on the GRE. We can't even find any more because we've already covered them all. If you go over to our YouTube channel, you'll see that, as well as a pretty cool vocabulary series that can help you learn some new words. So thanks, everybody. I'll see you again in a few weeks for the argument-based reading session. Thanks for being here today. And for the question I see in the chat about vocabulary, I'll leave that to the other upcoming lesson about the vocabulary type questions. So thanks, everybody. And I hope you have a great rest of your Thursday.